My first thought as I stepped off the bus into a foot of snow was, what have I gotten myself into? I was honestly incredibly happy to be back in the small town in Michigan where I had been born. We had moved away to the southwest when I was a teenager, and I had not been back since. I looked around the Greyhound station for Uncle Kit, who was supposed to pick me up. He wasn't really my uncle, and his name wasn't really Kit. He and my dad had worked together as mechanics for years, and he had been a close family friend all that time. Kit was what I had called him when I was young, a piece of his name that my juvenile mouth could pronounce, but it had stuck all this time. I spotted him sitting on a bench at the edge of the lot, reading a book. He was bundled up against the cold, but his beanie couldn't hide his long black hair, and his puffy clothing couldn't hide his muscled physique. I walked over to him, moving awkwardly from the weight of my bag on my shoulder, along with the uneven footing. As I came within a few feet of him, he looked up, and the late afternoon sun sank into the wrinkles on his dark brown face, which were a bit deeper than I remembered. He smiled and said, "Hey, kiddo, good to see you." He dropped his book on the bench and got up to embrace me in a big bear hug. I was shocked to realize I was almost the same height as him. He'd always seemed so much bigger than me. After he released me, he ushered me off towards his car, a 1961 Lincoln Continental he had been taking care of for as long as I could remember. "You could just stay with me, you know," he said, as he threw my bag in the back seat. "I know, Uncle Kit," I said, "but I already signed the rental agreement for this place. Besides, it's about time I was on my own." I had graduated from college the summer before, though my art degree had not helped me much in the pursuit of jobs, and none of the projects I had been working on had been profitable so far. I had been staying with my parents all through college, and I had felt bad there was no way for me to get out of the house in the foreseeable future. That is, until Uncle Kit had called my dad and offered to let me work at his shop. It was perfect. I would have steady work, a place of my own, and the opportunity to use the beautiful natural environment for inspiration. Plus, I had always wanted to return to my hometown. "What's the address of this place, anyway?" Uncle Kit said as we got into the car. I rattled it off from memory. I was kind of obsessed with the place. It was right on the edge of the woods, at the end of a street filled with old but charactered homes. It was fully furnished, and the rent was extremely cheap. As I said the address, however, Uncle Kit's eyebrows knitted together. I assumed that despite how small the town was, he was merely unfamiliar with the area it was in. So, I offered to ask for directions. "I know the place," he said. Then he started the car and took off down the road without any further talk. I asked him about what he was currently working on at the shop, and we talked about his repairs and projects for the whole 10 minutes it took to reach the house. I was getting increasingly excited as we came down the street. It was just as perfect as the pictures I had seen, until I noticed the bars on the windows of the homes we passed. Those had either not been present or just not been apparent in the pictures I had seen. "Has there been a lot of crime in this area lately?" "No crime," Uncle Kit said simply. "Are you sure you don't want to stay with me?" "I'll be fine, Uncle Kit," I said, though I didn't feel quite as confident as I hoped I sounded. As we pulled up to the house, my heart lifted a bit. It too had bars on the windows, but the sight of the forest off behind the house filled me with so much nostalgia that I didn't really care. I hopped out of the car as soon as it stopped. I grabbed my bag from the back and started looking for the planter the owner had told me about. There were quite a few of them on the front porch, but I followed his instructions to the one that sat underneath a window that looked out directly towards the front door, just off to the right of it. All the plants in the planters were dead, so I easily dug around in the loose soil until I unearthed the key there. I unlocked the door and turned to say goodbye to Uncle Kit. He was standing back near the stairs that led up to the porch, looking at the snow and tugging a few locks of hair that had fallen out of his beanie. He turned to look at me and said, "Now, Kurt, Promise me you won't go off walking in the woods until the snows melt, okay? Why? I said, shocked. I had played in woods much like these all the time as a kid, even during the winter, though on a different side of the town. These woods can be dangerous. Go to some other place if you want to walk in the woods. There are plenty of other places nearby. He continued to tug at a few locks of his hair as he turned to leave. I'll see you tomorrow, kiddo, he called, his back to me. I'll pick you up bright and early. He stopped and turned back. One more thing. Stay inside at night, will you? He slid into his car and drove off without waiting for an affirmative. I felt more than slightly annoyed. His words consumed my thoughts as I entered the house and walked from room to room. Did he think I was a child? It had been over a decade since I had seen him in person, and I had grown up during that time. I decided I could probably safely ignore advice meant for a teenage version of myself. The house was in good order. It was dusty, but all the rooms were full of beautiful furniture, and I felt myself coming to love the place, even as angry thoughts thundered through my head. I put my bag in the bedroom, laid back on the bed, and sighed. I looked out the window to my left. Judging by shadows, I assumed there was probably about an hour of sunlight left. Plenty of time for a quick walk in the woods. I gathered the few articles of clothing I had removed as I had toured the house, and after slipping my jacket and gloves back on, I was rushing out the front door and around the left side of the house, towards the woods. I passed what I supposed counted as the backyard as I walked. It had a low fence, about 5 feet tall, and it was falling apart in places. I shrugged. It was an old house. And besides, I didn't need a nicely fenced backyard. The forest was going to be my backyard for the foreseeable future. The thought filled me with joy as I approached the tall, stately trees covered in a coat of frost. When I crossed through the tree line, I noticed a sizable stream curved its way close to the edge of the forest there. There was no trail to follow, with all of the snow, but I could follow the path of the stream. I had been planning to stay near the edge of the forest, but now, with a definite way of preventing myself from getting lost, I was more than happy to go deeper into the forest. The next 20 minutes were some of the best of my life. The falling sun lit the forest in fiery hues when it found its way through the branches. Crystalline snow refracted orange and red light in beautiful cascades. I kept an eye on the stream from about 20 feet away, and though it was frozen over, I could imagine the sound of running water accompanying me. Eventually, as the sun got even lower, I decided it was time for me to make my way back. Despite my bristling at Uncle Kit's warnings, I knew it wouldn't be wise for me to be alone in the woods at night. A hill rose up before me, however, just on the bank of the river. It wasn't too steep, so I decided that I would turn around after I reached the top. It was pretty easy going, and I reached the top quickly. The stream was still down to my left, down a gentle slope. It looked like it was wider and shallower at this spot. Suddenly, I heard a noise off to my right, down the opposite side of the hill from the stream. It sounded like a thick branch snapping, but different. It's hard to describe. It was less springy, less protracted. It was a quick and brutal snap. Shortly after, a muffled sucking sound drifted from that direction. It sounded like someone slurping the last bit of soup out of the bowl. At that point, I was staring down the hill towards the source of the sounds, trying to see what was causing them. But the trees were thicker in that direction, and the hill was more steep and rocky, with numerous large boulders jutting into my line of sight. The slurping grew louder. I took a step backward from the noise, and my leg brushed a frozen bush. The friction on the fragile branch was enough to break it into several pieces, causing a light tinkling sound, like a tiny piece of glass breaking. I paused and heard something rustling through the bushes at the base of the hill. Remembering Uncle Kit's warnings, I felt it would be best to avoid encountering whatever I had been hearing. I sat down in the snow near the slope that led down to the stream. It was opposite where the noises had been coming from, so it seemed like the best way to go. I slid down the gentle slope on my back, reaching the bottom a few seconds later. The stream was a few feet away, and I gingerly tested the ground as I approached. It seemed relatively solid. I crossed the frozen stream slowly, on all fours, to spread my weight out. It was about 15 feet across here, and it took around a minute to cross. I scrambled up past the tree line and started heading back toward the house, but on the opposite side of the stream. I hoped whatever I had heard would be thrown off by the path I had taken and would let me be. I heard some more rustling on the opposite bank, and when I looked up towards the top of the hill on which I had stood, I saw a dark shape, low to the ground, half hidden among the trees. I kept walking, hoping the trees would hide me from sight. It looked like it might be a bear or maybe a wolf. The shape had been a lot thinner than what I would expect from a bear, though. Regardless, I did not want it to see me. About a minute later, I heard a low snuffling noise, followed by more rustling, and further light tinkling sounds, like the one I had produced on the hill, carried through the still forest and across the frozen stream. It was still just on the other side of the stream from me, this time at the base of the hill. I quickened my pace. It must have picked up my scent and was following me. A couple more tense minutes later, and the snuffling sounded like it was coming from just on the other side of the tree line, across the stream. I saw the dark shape again, still crouched low to the ground, still half hidden. Luckily, the stream at this point seemed a bit wider and deeper, and the ice seemed less thick. I felt relatively safe, so I crouched down behind a bush to watch whatever was following me. It had gotten a bit close for comfort, but I was ecstatic at the opportunity to observe an animal in the wild this near to me. I kept myself still as the shape moved into the gap between the trees, then moved from there into the clear area at the edge of the stream, into the increasingly low light. I froze, not quite comprehending what I was seeing. First, a huge gray hand with long, thin fingers shot into the light. It planted thick, wicked-looking black claws into the snow. Then, another hand shot out, further into the light, revealing an arm so thin it didn't look to be more than bone. Pulled behind these arms, a gaunt face slid into the light. I stifled the urge to scream. It was more than just gaunt. It looked like someone had fashioned an enormous skull and tried to pull a normal amount of human skin over it. Its nose was pulled back into the face, almost flat, and a bit of bone protruded from the tip of it. The teeth and gums were clearly revealed by lips that were held tightly to the skull, so tightly that they had barely moved as the creature's jaw worked. Its eyes were sunken and seemed to glow like embers. Its cheekbones jutted out like knives, and again, bits of bone poked out from under the skin. It crawled further into the light, revealing a body completely devoid of any fat or muscles. I could clearly see each bone of its body. It looked like nothing more than a giant skeleton to which someone had attached a facsimile of human skin. It looked dead, but its movements belied that. It was quickly crawling across the ground, sniffing the air as it went, with its arms out on the ground before it and its legs behind, in something that looked like a more graceful version of an army crawl. Its bones turned unnaturally to accommodate its crawling, its elbows pointing almost straight into the air, its knees turned out to the sides. It was fully in the light now, and I could see that if it was standing, it would undoubtedly top 10 feet tall. I felt like my blood was freezing in my veins. After a few moments, I realized that it was not only a result of the fear. The air was actually growing colder. I shivered, and my teeth clacked together. The figure on the other side of the stream slowly shifted its gaze towards me. As its eyes settled on me, the surroundings suddenly grew darker, and a strong wind blasted its way through the trees, throwing small crystals of ice through the air. I jumped up to my feet and started running as fast as I could toward my house. I turned my head for a moment to see that it was skittering across the stream on all fours. Its hand broke through the ice, and it fell into the water for a moment, but it didn't seem to care much. I saw its hands clutch the ice at the edge of the hole, and it pulled itself out quickly, its eyes still trained on me. I turned forward again narrowly avoiding turning my ankle on a fallen log. I kept my eyes forward after that. I couldn't afford to trip. Over the next few minutes, it kept getting darker, and the wind continued to pick up. Some part of me realized that there was something unnatural about that. There should have been minutes of sunlight left yet. I couldn't focus on that, however. I could only focus on running. Luckily, the footing on this side of the stream was relatively clear, and I kept a quick pace for the next few minutes. I could hear it behind me the whole time. It was gaining on me, slowly but surely. I spotted the bend in the stream ahead, barely visible in the growing darkness and blizzard-like winds. I ran across it, heedless of the danger of falling through the ice, with the more pressing danger of the creature behind me. Luckily, it held firm, and I burst out of the tree line a few moments later. The world brightened perceptibly as I left the forest, and the wind stilled immediately. I kept running, but I did take a moment to look over my shoulder again, now that the ground was clear. Back in the forest, the darkness and wind still reigned. It was like a bubble of blustery night was being held within its borders. Out in the open, I could see that the sun was just now setting, but the forest looked as dark as night. I couldn't see anything following me, but that did not stop my running. As I came around to the front of the house, I could see one of my neighbors out on their front porch. It was an elderly woman, and she was staring towards the forest. I wanted to call out for her to go inside, but my lungs couldn't handle the strain I had put them in. I wheezed a bit, but that was all I could muster. Regardless, she turned to go inside, and I heard the door slam shut as I turned left around the front of my house. My hands were shaking as I took the key out of my pocket and tried to unlock the door. That delayed me for several agonizing seconds. I thought I could hear the icy snow crunching off to my left as I finally slipped the key into the lock. I slammed and locked the door behind me and walked over to the window that looked out on the front porch. I couldn't see anything outside, but that didn't make me feel any better. I picked up the phone that I had seen as I toured the house earlier. Luckily, I had taken care of getting everything connected before I came. I went to sit down on the couch in the room that was just inside the front door, and I dialed Uncle Kit's number, though my hands were so unsteady that it took a few tries. As the phone rang, I put it on speaker and laid it on the table in front of me, while I pressed my hands into my lap and tried to stop them from shaking. I felt so cold. Colder than should have been possible with the amount of layers I had on.
Hello?
Uncle Kit's voice said from the table in front of me. "I saw it, Uncle Kit," I blurted out. "I saw it. The thing you were trying to warn me about, I didn't listen."
Where are you right now, kiddo? Are you safe?
I didn't answer at first. I was distracted by the sound of creaking boards coming from outside the front door. I stared at it for a moment, until Uncle Kit yelled.
Kurt!
"I'm in the house," I said. "The door is locked."
Make sure it stays that way for now. I'm coming over. I'll be there in about 10 minutes.
"Okay," I said. The fright in my voice was plain even to me. I sounded like a scared child.
When I get there, kiddo, you gotta let me in quick. But check through the peephole to see if it's really me before you open the door. Okay?
I didn't answer again. It was hard to make sense of what he was saying. Make sure it was really him? What did that mean?
Kurt, you're not just gonna leave me out in the cold, right?
His voice shook slightly, and I realized that he too was terrified. Uncle Kit? Scared? I shook my head trying to clear it and said, "I won't, Uncle Kit."
Good. Remember, you have to be sure that it really is me. Don't open the door until you've seen me.
"Okay," I said. The phone went silent. I didn't move to pick it up. I sat completely still, just listening. I could hear the wind picking up outside. I turned to look out one of the windows. It was fully dark out there now. Part of me wanted to close the blinds on the window, but I stayed where I was. It was dark in the house as well. I didn't move to turn on any lights. More creaking sounded from the front porch, but I convinced myself that it was just the wind shifting the house a bit. An indefinite amount of time passed. The house seemed to grow colder and colder. I could see the temperature on the thermostat in the room was set somewhere in the 60s, and I could hear the heater working furiously. Still, it grew colder. Just as I was about to grab the phone to check how long it had been since I talked to Uncle Kit, I heard heavy footsteps on the porch. I froze in place until I heard a knock at the door, and Uncle Kit's voice sounded through it.
Hello?
I grabbed the phone. The time flashed across the screen. It told me it had been about 8 minutes since I had called Uncle Kit. He must have been speeding to get there in under 10 minutes. I walked over to the front door, hand out toward the lock. He had told me to look through the peephole to make sure it was him, but I could hear his voice. Didn't that count as being sure? My fingers were inches away from it when his voice sounded through the door again.
Kurt!
Something about his voice gave me pause. I let my hand drop, logic finally winning through. I had ignored Uncle Kit's advice at first, and that is what had gotten me into the mess I was in. He had given me more advice. Was I really going to ignore that now? I leaned in close to the door and put my eye up to the peephole. It was completely dark. I couldn't see anything at all, not even the porch itself. I squinted, trying to see anything at all.
Kurt, you're not just gonna leave me out in the cold, right?
This close to the door, I realized what seemed off about the voice. There was a staticky quality to it, as if it were coming from a phone. Not only that, but I recognized that none of the words this voice had said were different from things Uncle Kit had said earlier. They were the same words, said with the same tone and inflection. Feeling a chill deeper than the cold of the surrounding air, I backed away from the door. There was another knock.
Kurt!
The voice said. He sounded scared, but Uncle Kit had sounded scared when he yelled my name earlier. I had to be sure. I turned left and walked into the room that contained the window that looked out on the porch.
Hello?
It said, as if it were answering a phone. I crept over to the window, ignoring the knocks on the door.
Kurt!
When I reached the window, I slowly raised my head to peer up over the sill. The first thing I saw were 2 points of red light hovering near the door. Then, the rest of the creature came into focus. It was standing on the porch, as tall as I had imagined it would be. It had to bend down to fit under the roof of the porch and to reach the door. One hand was pressed against the other side of the peephole on the door, covering it entirely. The other was making gentle knocking motions. Its legs were spread out wide to accommodate its low stance, and it was leaning against the door, head facing toward the window. After the moment's observation, I tried to duck out of sight, my muscles cramping in sudden terror. It saw me before I could get out of view. Its ember eyes locked onto mine, and it started to bend towards the window. It opened its mouth, lips and tongue not even moving, and Uncle Kit's voice came out.
Kurt, you're not just gonna leave me out in the cold, right?
The next moment, it leapt at the window, and one of its arms burst through the glass, shattering it. I scrambled back, but the creature began to wail in a trumpeting cacophony of voices. It sounded like a chorus of tortured human screams from dozens of different people, men, women, and children. I didn't understand why, but suddenly I couldn't move. That sound paralyzed me, and all my senses were completely overloaded. I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my body as it reached out for me. I was about 3 or 4 feet away from the window, but it could fit its long, spindly arm through the bars. Its claws scraped at my jacket as I laid there, helpless. They found purchase, and it began to pull me towards the window. I could see its jaws opening wider, pointed, wickedly sharp teeth waiting for my body to be close enough to bite. I was dead. I imagined it tearing pieces small enough to fit through the bars off my body until it had consumed it all. Then, a bright light shone on the creature from behind. I heard a yell and a car door slamming. It stopped screaming and glanced back over its shoulder. It looked at me again, one last time, then released me to fall to the floor. I heard it sprint across the porch and hop the railing. Still, I just laid there, too shocked to move. "Kurt! Kurt!" I heard. I didn't look out the window. I stared at the ceiling, sure that the creature was the one uttering the words. "Kurt, answer me." I heard footsteps on the porch again, and I finally had the presence of mind to move. I got up and ran away from the window. When I turned to look back, Uncle Kit was standing there. "Is that really you?" I wheezed, my voice breaking. Uncle Kit nodded and said, "It's me, kiddo. Now let me in before it comes back." I walked to the door and looked through the peephole, just to be sure. It was only Uncle Kit standing there. I let him in, then slammed the door and locked it. Uncle Kit promised he would spend the night there with me, then help me board up the window in the morning. I apologized to him for not heeding his advice. Then I demanded to know what had attacked me. Uncle Kit told me they didn't like to talk about him, out of respect for his family. He wouldn't tell me a name, but he said a man that used to live in this house went hunting with his friend in the woods a few years back. It was late in the year, but the snows hadn't come yet, and they wanted to get one last hunt in. Not long after they had left, a terrible blizzard suddenly blew in, and it snowed for days and days. The pair hadn't returned. When the weather calmed, people went out to look for them. After a few days, they found something, but it filled everyone with dread. They found a cave, the entrance of which had been completely covered in snow. A tunnel had been dug out of it, but when they went to look inside, the floor of the cave was covered in blood and broken bones. The marrow had been sucked out of all of them. When he told me this, my mind rushed back to the sound I had heard in the forest, and I felt ill. Uncle Kit said they knew immediately what had happened, and they all left the forest as quickly as they could. They took steps to defend this neighborhood, since it was on the border of that portion of the forest, and let the situation be. I asked him what the creature was called. He told me. Wendigo. I continued staying in the house after that night. I never went out after dark. I avoided the windows at night. I never went walking in the woods during the winter. I sometimes heard footsteps on the roof or on my porch. These were accompanied at times by pathetic begging and crying to be let into my house with a multitude of different voices. After a while, I got used to it. When spring came around, Uncle Kit told me it was safe not to follow the rules, at least until winter came again. I've been living in this house for a few years now. They have been some of the best of my life. Throughout most of the year, I wander through the woods on early morning or late afternoon walks. But as soon as the first snow threatens to fall, I take the necessary steps to avoid seeing the Wendigo again.